That night, when Marcus Hamilton stepped out of his black SUV after 12 years away, he expected champagne and celebration. Instead, he found his only son on his knees, scrubbing the marble floors of their own mansion, wearing a servant's uniform with his name stitched across the chest. The boy didn't even look up. He just kept scrubbing as if he'd been doing it his entire life. Marcus stood there, frozen, watching the thin, exhausted young man work, and for the first time in his billionaire life, he had no idea what to do. Because that wasn't just any servant. That was David, his son. The heir to everything he'd built, and nobody had told him a thing. This is the true story of how a father's ambition, a mother's obsession, and a family's silence destroyed a boy's childhood and turned privilege into punishment. It's about what happens when image matters more than love, when pride becomes more important than protection, and when the people who should care for you the most become the ones who hurt you the deepest. What Marcus did when he discovered the truth didn't just shock his family. It changed an entire community. But to understand how a billionaire's son ended up living like a ghost in his own home, we need to go back to where it all started. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 12 years earlier, Marcus Hamilton was a man the business world both admired and feared. He'd built his fortune from nothing, starting with a small construction company in Detroit and expanding into real estate, technology, and international trade. By the time his son David was 7 years old, Marcus owned properties in 14 countries and employed over 3,000 people. His wife, Catherine, came from old money, the kind of family where your last name opened doors before you even knocked. She was elegant, poised, and obsessed with maintaining the family's social standing. Their marriage wasn't built on romance. It was built on strategy. He brought new money and ambition. She brought connections and respectability. Together they were unstoppable. Their son David was supposed to be the perfect combination of both worlds, raised to inherit an empire and lead it into the future. But David was different from what they expected. He was quiet where they wanted confidence, gentle where they wanted strength, and curious about people rather than profits. While other wealthy children bragged about their parents' yachts and vacation homes, David asked the housekeeper about her grandchildren. He helped the gardener plant flowers. He sat in the kitchen with the cook and learned to make bread. Marcus noticed but didn't worry. He assumed the boy would grow out of it. Catherine, however, saw it as a problem. She watched her son prefer the company of staff over the children of senators and CEOs, and it embarrassed her. At dinner parties, while other parents boasted about their children's achievements at private schools and exclusive camps, Catherine had to explain why David volunteered at the local food bank instead of attending tennis lessons. To her, David's kindness wasn't a virtue. It was a weakness, a stain on the family image she'd worked so hard to craft. Marcus was too focused on expanding his empire to notice the growing tension. He traveled constantly, spending weeks overseas negotiating deals, acquiring properties and building connections. When he was home, he was either in his office or at business dinners. He loved his son in the abstract way busy fathers often do, proud of the idea of him but disconnected from the reality. He told himself he was building this empire for David, that one day his son would understand and appreciate the sacrifice. But David didn't need an empire. He needed his father. The boy spent his evenings waiting by the window, watching for his father's car. He saved up stories to tell him, practiced questions to ask, hoped that maybe tonight they'd have dinner together. Most nights, Marcus didn't come home until David was already asleep. On the rare occasions they did share a meal, Marcus was distracted, checking his phone, reviewing contracts, his mind already on the next deal. David learned to stop waiting. He learned to find comfort elsewhere with the people who actually had time for him. Maria, the housekeeper, became like a grandmother. She taught him to speak Spanish and shared stories about her own children. Robert, the elderly gardener, showed him how to grow tomatoes and explained the patience required to nurture living things. These people, who his mother barely acknowledged, became David's real family. Everything changed on a Tuesday in October, 3 months after David's 8th birthday. Marcus received an opportunity he couldn't refuse, a chance to establish his company's presence in Southeast Asia, to build resort properties and commercial complexes that would multiply his wealth several times over. It would require him to be based in Singapore for what he estimated would be 6 months, maybe a year at most. He sat David down the night before his flight and promised he'd be back soon, that this was important for their future, that he was doing this for him. David nodded and didn't cry, even though he wanted to. He'd learned that crying disappointed his father. Marcus left the next morning, and 6 months turned into a year. A year turned into 2. Phone calls became less frequent, video chats were always rushed and interrupted by business matters. The promised visits home kept getting postponed. Marcus told himself he was almost finished, that just one more deal, one more project, and then he'd return. But there was always one more. Catherine was left to manage both the household and her husband's domestic business interests, a role she embraced with cold efficiency. She hired managers, restructured operations, and proved herself more than capable. But she also became harder, more controlling, more obsessed with perfection and appearances. With Marcus gone, there was no buffer between her and David, no one to soften her disappointment in who her son was becoming. David, now 10 years old, had stopped asking when his father would return. He'd stopped trying to please his mother. Instead, he doubled down on the things that gave his life meaning, his friendships with the staff, his volunteer work, his small acts of kindness that his mother found so mortifying. He started a project collecting old clothes and toys from neighbors' children and distributing them to families in need. He spent his allowance buying groceries for elderly people in the area. When his mother hosted charity galas, David would slip away to talk with the catering staff, learning their names, asking about their lives, treating them like human beings rather than invisible servants. Catherine's frustration grew with each incident. The final breaking point came during Catherine's most important event of the year, a dinner party for 50 of the city's most influential families. She'd spent weeks planning every detail. This was her moment to prove that even without her husband present, she could maintain their family's status and command respect. David was instructed to dress in his best suit, greet the guests politely, and then retire to his room. Simple enough. Instead, halfway through the evening, Catherine found her son in the kitchen. He wasn't hiding or sneaking food. He was sitting at the staff table, eating with the servers and dishwashers, laughing at their jokes, completely oblivious to the fact that one of her guests had wandered back and witnessed the scene. The guest, a prominent socialite known for her gossip, smiled with false sweetness and said loud enough for others to hear that it was so progressive of Catherine to raise her son without any sense of class distinction, though she wondered if perhaps it might cause confusion about his place in the world. The comment rippled through the party. Catherine's face burned with humiliation. That night, after the guests left and the staff had cleaned up, Catherine made a decision. She didn't yell or lecture. She simply told David that things were going to change. If he wanted to live like the help, if he preferred their company to his own class, then he would learn exactly what their lives were really like. She stripped his room of everything except a bed and a small dresser. She withdrew him from his private school, telling the administration he'd be homeschooled. She fired Maria and Robert, the 2 staff members David was closest to, replacing them with people who understood that the boy was not to be coddled or befriended. And then she gave David a uniform, the same navy blue outfit worn by the household staff, and a list of daily chores. Cleaning, cooking, serving, whatever needed to be done. She told him this was temporary, that it was a lesson about privilege and respect, that once he learned to appreciate what he had, things would return to normal. But in her heart, Catherine had already made up her mind. She decided that if her son insisted on embarrassing her, she would simply erase him from her public life. She told her social circle that David had been sent to an elite boarding school in Switzerland, a lie that was easier to maintain than the truth. Most people didn't question it. Wealthy families shipped their children off to distant schools all the time. Marcus, thousands of miles away and buried in work, was told the same story. Catherine sent him photos she'd pulled from school websites, mentioned fictional achievements and progress reports. Marcus, trusting his wife and relieved that his son was being properly educated, didn't dig deeper. He was busy building an empire. Catherine was handling the home front. That's what they'd always agreed on. David's life became unrecognizable. He woke up at 5:30 every morning before the sun rose to begin his chores. He cleaned bathrooms, mopped floors, helped prepare breakfast for his mother and her occasional guests. He learned to make beds with hospital corners, to polish silver until it gleamed, to move through rooms silently so as not to disturb anyone important. The new staff members treated him with cold indifference at best, and casual cruelty at worst. The head of household, a stern woman named Mrs. Pierce who'd been hired specifically because she had no sympathy for privileged children, made sure David understood his place. When he made mistakes, she docked his small allowance. When he complained, she added extra tasks. When he tried to explain who he was, she laughed and told him that if he really was Catherine Hamilton's son, she certainly wouldn't be working him like a common servant, would she? The logic was circular and crushing. Some of the staff felt uncomfortable with the arrangement but said nothing, afraid of losing their jobs. David learned to survive by becoming invisible. He stopped trying to claim his identity. He stopped fighting the situation. He simply endured, day after day, month after month, year after year. He grew taller but thinner, his shoulders developing a permanent hunch from hours of scrubbing and carrying. His hands became rough and calloused. His expensive private school education was replaced by whatever books he could sneak from the mansion's library late at night, reading by flashlight in his bare room after everyone else had gone to sleep. Catherine saw him daily but rarely spoke to him beyond giving instructions. She'd perfected the art of looking through him rather than at him. On the rare occasions when old family friends visited the house and happened to see David working, Catherine explained him away as a young man from a program she supported, giving underprivileged youth job training and work experience. People nodded approvingly at her charity. No one recognized the boy. He'd changed too much, and besides, everyone believed David Hamilton was studying in Europe. The cruelest part wasn't the physical work or even the loss of comfort. It was the isolation, the complete erasure of his identity and his past. David had no friends, no school, no connection to the outside world. He existed in a strange limbo, neither truly a servant nor a son, invisible to everyone who might have helped him. He celebrated his 11th birthday alone in his room. His 12th. His 13th. Nobody acknowledged them. There were no cakes, no presents, no phone calls from his father. Marcus remained overseas, his business ventures growing more complex and time-consuming. His communication with Catherine became mostly emails about financial matters and property management. He asked about David occasionally, and Catherine assured him everything was fine. The boy was thriving at school, making friends, growing into a fine young man. Marcus wanted to believe it. It was easier than confronting the guilt he felt about being an absent father. David stopped thinking about rescue. He stopped imagining his father bursting through the door to save him. He stopped hoping his mother would suddenly remember that she loved him. Instead, he focused on survival and on the strange freedom that came with having nothing left to lose. He began to notice things about the other staff members that he'd never paid attention to before, their struggles, their kindness despite hardship, their quiet dignity. A young woman named Sophie worked in the kitchen while putting herself through community college, taking night classes and studying whenever she had a break. She shared her textbooks with David when she realized he was hungry for knowledge. An older man named James, who maintained the grounds, had been a teacher before an accident left him partially disabled and unable to find work in education. He spent his lunch breaks teaching David history and literature, speaking in whispers so Mrs. Pierce wouldn't overhear. These small acts of human kindness became David's education in what truly mattered. He learned that wealth didn't determine worth, that dignity wasn't something you inherited, and that real strength came from enduring hardship without losing your humanity. By the time David turned 15, he'd become someone his father wouldn't recognize. He was quiet, watchful, deeply empathetic, and impossibly patient. He understood struggle in a way most wealthy teenagers never would. He knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be judged by appearance, to have your worth determined by your usefulness to others. And he knew something else too. He knew that if he ever escaped this life, if he ever reclaimed his identity, he would never forget what he'd learned in these years. He would never become like his mother, so obsessed with appearances that she'd sacrifice her own child. And he would never become like his father, so focused on building wealth that he'd forget to be present for the people who mattered most. Marcus Hamilton's return wasn't planned. It was supposed to be another 2 years before he wrapped up his overseas operations and came home permanently. But on a Tuesday morning, 12 years after he'd left, he received a phone call that changed everything. His business partner in Singapore, the man who'd been handling the day-to-day operations, had been arrested for fraud and embezzlement. The entire operation was under investigation. Marcus's name was attached to properties and contracts that he now discovered had been acquired through bribes and illegal dealings. He hadn't known, hadn't been involved, but that didn't matter. His reputation was at stake. He needed to return home immediately to protect his domestic assets, to manage the crisis from his own territory, to salvage what he could of his empire. He boarded a plane that same day. The flight gave him 13 hours to think about everything he'd sacrificed for his business, everything he'd missed. David would be 19 now. Marcus tried to picture him, probably finishing up at that boarding school in Switzerland, maybe already attending university. He felt a wave of guilt for all the birthdays he'd missed, all the milestones he hadn't witnessed. He promised himself that once this crisis was resolved, he'd make things right with his son. He'd bring him home, really get to know him, make up for lost time. The SUV picked him up from the airport at 10:30 at night. Marcus gave the driver his home address, a place he hadn't seen in 12 years. The mansion looked exactly the same from the outside, imposing and perfect, every light glowing warm against the night sky. Marcus paid the driver and stood for a moment at the gates, looking up at the house he'd bought 20 years ago. He used his key and pushed open the heavy front door. The entrance hall was empty. No Catherine rushing to greet him. No staff alerted to his arrival. Just silence and the faint smell of lemon polish. Marcus set down his suitcase and walked deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. That's when he saw him, a young man in a servant's uniform, on his hands and knees, scrubbing the floor with a brush. The boy didn't look up, just kept working with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this task 1,000 times before. Marcus was about to walk past him when something made him stop. Maybe it was the shape of the boy's shoulders. Maybe it was the way he held his head. Maybe it was just instinct. Marcus took a step closer and the boy finally looked up. Their eyes met and the world stopped. Marcus saw a thin, exhausted young man with dark circles under his eyes and calloused hands gripping a scrub brush. But he also saw, beneath the exhaustion and the years, the unmistakable features of his son. The same eyes. The same shape of his face. The scar on his left eyebrow from when he'd fallen off his bicycle at age 6. David stared back at him with an expression that wasn't surprise or relief or joy. It was resignation, as if he'd given up hoping for this moment so long ago that its arrival meant nothing anymore. Marcus couldn't breathe. His mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing, tried to reconcile the image of his son in Switzerland with this reality of his son on his knees in his own home. David spoke first, his voice quiet and careful. "Welcome home, sir. Not dad. Not father. Sir." As if Marcus was just another employer, another person to serve. Marcus felt something break inside his chest, a physical pain that had nothing to do with his body and everything to do with the sudden, crushing understanding that he'd abandoned his son, that while he'd been building his empire, his family had collapsed in ways he couldn't have imagined. The revelation, 26:00-32:00. Catherine appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of voices. When she saw her husband standing in the entrance hall, staring at David, she went pale. For the first time in 12 years, her carefully constructed facade cracked. Marcus turned to her slowly, his face a mask of controlled rage. He didn't yell. He didn't shout. He simply asked, in a voice that was somehow worse than screaming, "What happened to our son?" Catherine tried to explain. She tried to justify. She told him about David's behavior, about the embarrassment, about how she tried to teach him a lesson that had simply gone on longer than intended. She talked about maintaining appearances, about protecting the family name, about how David had never complained, so she'd assumed he'd learned his lesson and accepted his role. With every word, she sounded more desperate and less convincing. Marcus listened in silence, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. He listened as his wife explained how she'd lied to him for 12 years, how she'd told their entire social circle that David was away at school, how she'd sent Marcus fake updates and photos, how she'd systematically erased their son from his own life. When Catherine finally stopped talking, the silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus turned back to David, who was still kneeling on the floor, still holding the scrub brush. "Stand up," Marcus said. David hesitated, then slowly got to his feet. He was taller than Marcus expected, almost 6 feet, but thin in a way that suggested years of not quite enough food. "How long?" Marcus asked. "How long have you been living like this?" David looked at his mother, then back at his father. "Since I was 10, he said. "Since you left." The words hit Marcus like a punch. Since he left. Not since Catherine decided to punish him. Since Marcus had chosen business over family, since he'd stopped checking in, since he'd accepted easy lies instead of demanding truth. This wasn't just Catherine's failure. It was his too. Marcus spent the rest of that night piecing together the full story. He questioned every member of the household staff. He called his lawyers. He called his accountant. He discovered that Catherine had been paying the staff generously to maintain their silence, that she'd created an entire false paper trail of tuition payments to a boarding school that David had never attended. Some of the staff confessed tearfully that they'd felt wrong about the situation but had been too afraid of losing their jobs to speak up. Others, like Sophie and James, had tried to help David in small ways, giving him books and education and human kindness when no one was watching. One thing became clear: David had survived not because of any privilege he'd been born into, but because of his own resilience and the compassion of people who had every reason to resent him but chose kindness instead. By dawn, Marcus had made his decisions. He fired Mrs. Pierce immediately, along with 2 other staff members who had been particularly cruel to David. He told Catherine to pack her things and leave the house. She would get a financial settlement, enough to live comfortably but nothing more. He was filing for divorce. Catherine tried to argue, tried to claim that she'd been protecting their son in her own way. Marcus cut her off. "You didn't teach him humility," he said. "You taught him that his own mother valued appearances more than his well-being. You taught him that love is conditional, that family is a lie. And you taught me that I failed him by trusting you, by being absent, by building wealth while my son's childhood was stolen." Catherine left that morning, still trying to maintain her dignity even as her world crumbled. Marcus then gathered all the household staff in the main living room. He stood in front of them and apologized. He apologized for not knowing what was happening in his own home, for creating an environment where his wife could abuse their son and everyone was too afraid to stop her. He told them that things were going to change, that anyone who wanted to stay would be treated with respect and dignity. Most of them chose to stay. They'd seen something change in Marcus that night, a humanity they hadn't known existed. But Marcus's biggest challenge wasn't restructuring his household or managing his business crisis or divorcing his wife. It was figuring out how to be a father to a son he barely knew, a son who'd spent 9 years learning not to expect anything from him. The first few weeks were painfully awkward. Marcus didn't know how to talk to David, didn't know what to say to bridge 12 years of absence and 9 years of suffering. He kept wanting to give grand gestures, to buy things, to throw money at the problem because that's what he knew how to do. But David didn't want things. He didn't want a new wardrobe or a new car or a trip to Europe. He just wanted to be left alone, to process what had happened, to figure out who he was now that his life had been turned upside down again. Marcus realized that he couldn't rush this, couldn't fix it quickly. So he did something he'd never been good at. He waited. He made himself present. He started having breakfast with David every morning, even when neither of them knew what to say. He asked questions about David's life, about what he'd experienced, and then he listened without interrupting, without trying to explain or justify. He heard about the loneliness, the exhaustion, the small cruelties and the small kindnesses. He heard about the books David had read by flashlight, the way Sophie had shared her college textbooks, the way James had taught him history. And with every story, Marcus felt the weight of his failure grow heavier. One night, about a month after his return, Marcus found David in the library, reading the same way he had as a child, curled up in an oversized chair. Marcus sat down across from him and said the words he should have said 12 years ago. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I didn't check on you. I'm sorry I believed easy lies instead of demanding the truth. I'm sorry I built an empire while you were suffering. I'm sorry I wasn't here." David looked up from his book. "You didn't know," he said quietly. "I should have known," Marcus replied. "A father should know." They sat in silence for a while, and then David asked the question that had been weighing on him. "Why did you come back? Was it because of me?" Marcus wanted to lie, wanted to say yes, wanted to be the hero of this story. But he owed his son honesty. "No," he admitted. "I came back because my business collapsed. I came back because I had to, not because I wanted to. If things had gone according to plan, I'd still be overseas, and you'd still be scrubbing floors, and I would never have known." The truth hung between them, ugly and undeniable. But there was something powerful in that honesty, something that created space for real connection rather than pretty lies. David nodded slowly. "At least you're telling me the truth," he said. "That's more than she ever did." Over the following months, Marcus began to understand his son in ways he never had before. David wasn't the heir he'd imagined, wasn't interested in business empires or wealth accumulation. But he was smart, deeply empathetic, and possessed a wisdom that came from surviving something most people couldn't imagine. David started helping with the household in a different way, Not as a servant but as someone who understood how things worked, who knew the staff's concerns, who could bridge the gap between management and workers. He suggested changes that made everyone's lives better, more reasonable schedules, better pay, treating people like human beings rather than disposable resources. Marcus watched his son navigate these relationships with grace and genuine care, and he realized that David had learned something in those 9 years that Marcus had never learned in 50 years of life. He'd learned that people mattered more than profit, that dignity wasn't determined by status, that true strength came from compassion rather than control. Marcus started asking David for advice, first about household matters, then about business decisions. David would ask questions that Marcus had never considered. How will this decision affect the workers? Is this profit worth the cost to people's lives? Are we building something that makes the world better or just making ourselves richer? 6 months after his return, Marcus gathered David and some trusted advisors and told them about an idea that had been forming in his mind. His overseas empire had collapsed, leaving him with still substantial but greatly reduced wealth. He could spend the next decade trying to rebuild what he'd lost, or he could do something different. Something that mattered. Marcus proposed turning the mansion into a foundation, a place dedicated to helping young people who'd fallen through society's cracks. Kids from foster care, children of incarcerated parents, teenagers aging out of the system with nowhere to go, young people who worked menial jobs while trying to educate themselves. The house that had been a symbol of wealth and status would become a symbol of second chances. David listened to his father's pitch, and for the first time since Marcus had returned, he smiled. A real smile. "I think that's the best idea you've ever had," David said. They started small, converting several wings of the mansion into living quarters and study spaces. They partnered with local colleges to provide tutoring and mentorship. They hired social workers and counselors. They created job training programs, teaching practical skills while also emphasizing education and personal growth. And David, at 19 years old, became the heart of the operation. He understood these kids in ways that no social worker or therapist could. He'd lived it. He knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be judged by circumstances beyond your control, to have potential that nobody recognized. The young people who came through the foundation's doors connected with him immediately. They could sense that he wasn't some wealthy kid playing at charity. He was someone who understood. When they talked about feeling worthless, he didn't give them platitudes. He told them about scrubbing floors in his own home while his mother pretended he didn't exist. When they talked about feeling invisible, he shared how he'd learned to find strength in that invisibility. Marcus watched his son transform the foundation into something extraordinary. David hired several former staff members who'd shown him kindness, giving them positions of real responsibility and respect. Sophie became the education coordinator, using her own experience of working through college to help others navigate the same path. James became a teacher again, working with kids who'd been told they weren't smart enough for real education. The foundation grew beyond what Marcus had initially imagined. They opened a free medical clinic. They started a legal aid program for young people facing unjust system barriers. They created a job placement network that connected their graduates with employers who valued character and potential over traditional credentials. News of what they were doing spread through the community. People who'd known the Hamiltons only as wealthy elites were shocked by the transformation. Some praised it. Others criticized it as performative. David didn't care about the criticism. He cared about the 16-year-old girl who'd been living in her car and now had a safe place to sleep and study. He cared about the young man who'd aged out of foster care and now had job training and a path forward. 1 year after the foundation opened, they held an event to celebrate their first group of graduates. Marcus stood at the back of the room watching David give a speech. His son talked about second chances, about how circumstances don't define you, about how the worst experiences can teach the most valuable lessons if you survive them with your humanity intact. He talked about the people who'd shown him kindness when they didn't have to, and how that kindness had saved him. When he was asked how he'd survived those 9 years, David thought for a moment before answering. "I survived because I learned that my worth wasn't determined by how people treated me. I survived because a few people saw me as human when they could have just seen me as a servant. And I survived because I believed that someday, somehow, things would change. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I refused to let that situation destroy who I was at my core." The room erupted in applause and Marcus found himself crying. These weren't tears of sadness, though there was sadness in them. They were tears of pride, of grief for lost years, of gratitude that despite everything, his son had become someone extraordinary, not because of his wealth or his name but because of his character. After the event, David found his father outside looking up at the mansion. They stood together in comfortable silence, and then David said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. "You know, I used to hate this place. I used to lie in bed at night and imagine it burning down. But now, when I see kids walking through those doors and finding hope, I think maybe all of it happened for a reason. Maybe I needed to understand suffering so I could help others survive it." Marcus looked at his son. "I don't think it happened for a reason," Marcus said carefully. "I think you gave it reason. You took something terrible and transformed it into something beautiful. That's not fate. That's you choosing to be better than what was done to you." 2 years have passed since that night when Marcus returned home and found his son on his knees. The foundation has helped over 200 young people reclaim their lives and their futures. Marcus still runs some business operations, but his focus has shifted entirely. He measures success differently now, not in profits and properties but in lives changed and hope restored. Catherine lives in another state and David has no contact with her. She sent a letter once, attempting to explain herself, to ask for forgiveness. David read it and then put it away without responding. He told his father that forgiveness might come someday, but it wouldn't come from pressure or obligation. It would come if and when he was ready. Marcus understood. Some wounds take a lifetime to heal. David is now 21 years old. He's enrolled in college, studying social work and psychology, taking classes while continuing to run the foundation's daily operations. He still lives in the mansion, but in a different wing now, in rooms he chose himself. He still wakes up early not because he has to, but because the habit is ingrained. But instead of scrubbing floors, he spends those quiet morning hours planning programs, reviewing applications from young people who need help. The relationship between father and son isn't perfect. There are still moments of tension, still conversations that feel awkward, still a distance that 12 years of absence created. David sometimes wonders who he would have been if his childhood hadn't been stolen. Marcus sometimes wonders if he'll ever fully forgive himself for choosing ambition over presence. But they've learned to exist in the space between perfect reconciliation and permanent estrangement. They have breakfast together most mornings. They work together on the foundation. They're building something new, not trying to recreate what was lost but creating something different, something honest, something real. The foundation has become known throughout the city through word of mouth. Young people telling other young people that there's a place that will see them, help them, give them a chance. And David meets each one with the same understanding, the same recognition of their humanity, because he knows exactly what it feels like to be invisible and exactly how much it means when someone finally sees you. Marcus often thinks about the night he came home, that moment when he looked down and saw his son scrubbing the floor. He thinks about how close he came to walking past him, to not recognizing him, to remaining ignorant while David suffered in plain sight. The business scandal that brought him home destroyed his empire but saved his soul. He lost millions of dollars and gained back his son. When people ask him if he regrets his choices, if he wishes he'd stayed overseas and protected his wealth, Marcus always says the same thing. "I regret that I left in the first place. I regret every day I wasn't there. But I don't regret coming home when I did, and I don't regret what we've built from the wreckage." You can always make more money. You can't get back lost time. David's perspective is more complex. When people ask him about those 9 years, about how he survived, about whether he's angry, he takes his time answering. "Sometimes I'm angry," he admits. "Sometimes I lie awake at night thinking about all the things I missed, all the years I can never get back. But then I look at the work we're doing now and I see kids who are going through worse than I did, and I realize that anger is just energy. You can let it destroy you or you can transform it into something useful. I chose to transform it. That doesn't mean everything is fine now. It means I refuse to let what happened to me be the end of my story." On the 2-year anniversary of Marcus's return, father and son stood together in the entrance hall, the same spot where they'd first seen each other after 12 years apart. The marble floors that David once scrubbed on his hands and knees now gleamed under the footsteps of young people moving through the building with purpose and hope. "Someone asked me yesterday if I've forgiven you," David said quietly. "I told them I'm working on it. I told them that forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a choice you make over and over again. Some days I look at you and I see the father who abandoned me. Other days I see the father who came home, who believed me, who walked away from wealth to build something meaningful. I'm learning to hold both of those truths at the same time. You failed me and you're trying to make it right. Both things are true. Marcus nodded. That's fair, he said. That's more than fair. David added one more thing. But I want you to know that despite everything, I'm glad you came home. I'm glad we're doing this together. I'm glad I got the chance to know you, even if it came later than it should have. Marcus reached out and pulled his son into an embrace, and David didn't pull away. They stood there holding on to each other and holding on to hope that healing, however imperfect and incomplete, was possible. So what would you do if you were David? Could you forgive a parent who allowed your childhood to be stolen? Could you forgive a father who was absent during the years you needed him most? Could you take the worst experience of your life and transform it into something that helps others? And if you were Marcus, how would you live with the knowledge that you failed your child in the most fundamental way? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. But they're questions worth asking because all of us are dealing with the consequences of choices made by ourselves and others. We're all trying to figure out how to build something meaningful from broken pieces. We're all learning that the things we think matter, wealth, status, appearances, often matter far less than the things we take for granted: presence, love, dignity, human connection. David's story isn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. It's a real story about real pain and the hard work of healing. It's about learning that you can survive the worst and still choose kindness. It's about discovering that your worth isn't determined by how people treat you but by who you choose to be despite that treatment. It's about second chances and hard truths and the slow, difficult process of rebuilding trust. And most importantly, it's about the truth that we all need to remember. The people who should love us most are capable of hurting us deepest, but that doesn't mean love itself is a lie. It means love is complicated, that families are imperfect, that forgiveness is a journey rather than a destination. What happened to David should never have happened. No child should be erased from their own life, punished for having compassion, treated as invisible in their own home. But he survived. And not just survived, he transformed his suffering into service, his pain into purpose, his invisibility into a mission to see others who society overlooks. That's the real shock of this story. Not what was done to him, but what he chose to do afterward. Not that a mother could be so cruel or a father so absent, but that a son could be so strong. Not that a family could fall apart so completely, but that it could be rebuilt, differently and imperfectly, into something real. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, if it made you question your own choices or relationships or priorities, then leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what you would do in David's situation. Tell us if you believe people can really change, if forgiveness is possible, if wealth and status are worth sacrificing presence and love. And if you made it all the way to the end of this story, if you stayed for every moment of David's journey, then you understand something important. You understand that the best stories aren't about perfect people making perfect choices. They're about real people surviving real pain and choosing, despite everything, to build something better. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories that make you think and feel, stories that remind you what truly matters in life, stories that challenge you to examine your own choices and relationships. Because we all have blind spots. We all have failures. We all have opportunities to do better. David's story is a mirror. When you look into it, what do you see?